Who were the ancient Greeks and how do we actually know? In this conversation, I speak with Professor Richard Janko. He's one of the world's leading scholars of ancient Greek literature, philosophy, and the transmission of texts. This is a conversation that covers the grand arc of Greek history, from the Minoans and Mycenaeans to the rise of city-states and the Peloponnesian War. Richard explains how Greek texts survived through the destruction of Greek and Roman civilization, through the Middle Ages, up to the present day. We discuss what these writings tell us about how the Greeks understood religion, the cosmos, and their place in the world. This is the Escape Sapiens podcast. If you enjoy deep dive conversations with some of the brightest minds shaping how we understand the world, then please subscribe or leave a comment. It costs you nothing and keeps the show going. And now, here's Richard Janko on the ancient Greeks. I hope you enjoy.
Escape Sapiens.
So, for the average listener, their view of the ancient Greeks will be somewhat monolithic, right? They'll maybe view them as one culture. They'll have a vague idea of when they existed. But so just to set the context for the conversation, who were the Greeks? Let's say we break up the timeline from 800 BCE to, say, 300. Who were the main powers and what's the broad view of the timeline?
Well, I actually have to take us back a little further than that because the Greeks were actually an amalgam of different peoples. There were some people living in the Aegean before people speaking Greek arrived. And we don't know much about them. They were called the Minoans, and they spoke a language that we still don't know and can't understand, despite the existence of written documents. And the Greeks came in, and they were very backward people. They came from the homeland of the Indo-Europeans, probably north of the Black Sea, in what's now Ukraine. And they were very backward. But over several centuries, they established substantial kingdoms. They became very wealthy. They created massive places like Mycenae, and they appear to have attacked Troy. That is, of course, the subject of their greatest epic, the epics of Homer.
Could I ask, is that a real story? Do we think that Troy is reality?
Yes, I think the evidence from the Hittite archives is pretty strong. That there was conflict between the Greeks and the Hittites over their little dependency at Troy, and called Wilusa by the Hittites, Welion by the early Greeks, and now Ilion. And these conflicts actually happened. And then the Bronze Age collapsed in a very dramatic fashion, probably because of these conflicts. I mean, that's the subject for another podcast from the one you want to do here. But I could certainly talk about that for an hour.
This is the Bronze Age collapse, the Sea People.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that. There's new evidence actually which you can get out of the Linear B tablets for understanding that. And at that point, the different parts of the Greek world got all mixed up with each other. There were much rougher mountain-dwelling people called Dorians who moved into the south of Greece, which had been where the Mycenaean civilization, which was very advanced, was concentrated. And they set up kingdoms in the Peloponnese. Athens seems to have survived from the Mycenaean time without being overrun. But and then there was a great deal of mixture and ferment and upheaval. But through it all, there survived a memory of the greatness of the earliest Greeks, the Mycenaeans, as we call them, who were active down to about 1200 when all this collapse and the Sea Peoples' involvement in Greece took place. And then they gradually, things became more orderly, trade with the East resumed, and the Greeks actually learned how to write from the Phoenicians. They learned writing, but what the Greeks contributed was the earliest alphabet. They wrote down vowels. And the addition of vowels to the alphabet was the biggest thing they did. And it was a very, very big technological leap because finally you could record what a language actually sounded like. And by writing it down, the Greeks, they were already writing on their pottery by the time of Homer. Of course, we don't know much about Homer. He lived maybe, in my opinion, around sometime after 800 BCE. And his poems got taken down, probably by dictation. There was no other real way to do it. And a poet who was producing from his mind the story of Troy and shaping it and presenting it in a complex form of verse had to be relying on a long tradition of oral poetry, which had gone on for centuries. And the earliest literature was actually oral literature. It wasn't written down, it was just performed, and each performance was a rehearsal for the next one.
Could I ask you about that actually? How stable do we think oral tradition was? Do we have sort of text in parallel with oral tradition over centuries that shows that it's stable, or how well can we trust it?
It's a great question. There's been a lot of controversy over this. But I think from the evidence of oral traditions that exist in other parts of the world, and especially in Bosnia and the Balkans, it's become clear that most oral poetry, it wasn't fixed, but it did follow set storylines. But sometimes poets came along who romanticized, who elaborated, who put things together and created much greater epics where they dramatized it and brought in the characters speaking. There was some resentment against those poets by other poets for transgressing the boundaries of the traditional stories. I think Homer was one of those. And Pindar actually accuses Homer of being inaccurate and making things up. And there's some recent research by a Yugoslav scholar, Zlatan Čelaković, who has shown this rather convincingly. And so Homer's poems were actually much greater than his tradition. They transcended it, but they were still part of it. They still depended on it. And they certainly didn't depend on writing, I think. So my earliest research was actually on that. It was to show that these poems had to be created out of by dictation and were each created at a different time from each other, the Iliad being earlier than the Odyssey. And I proved this by using statistics, and my statistics have not been disproved. It's rather like, for you scientists, measuring rates of radioactive decay. I was looking at how sound changes in the endings of words, very common phenomena, were implemented. You can't study just the odd word here and there. You have to look at something common to get a statistic that's meaningful out of the texts. And I was able to show that the Homeric poems were the oldest Greek literature that we have, and that Hesiod, with his great encoding of Greek religious belief, comes after Homer. And so that takes us down to 800 BC. And I think, though, that the epic tradition very much supports the reality of the Mycenaeans' involvement with Troy, and there was definitely something going on there. And I could talk more about that, but let's move on.
No. So you brushed over this statistical analysis of language. What does that actually look like? So, what is your input, and are you looking at poems, different copyings of the same poem across time?
No, we don't have that. The text of the Iliad is fairly unified. There's only one version of it. It doesn't have versions with separate episodes and characters doing different things. It's one version. And we can have pretty good access to that version. But within that version, I was looking at how frequently Homer uses one ending for the genitive and not another one, which is the product of a later linguistic development. And I could track the percentages by which innovations come into those endings. As I said, rather like models of radioactive decay in looking at the transformation of lead from its different isotopes over time, so that you can actually date different layers of rock. It was that kind of research, and I was fascinated by geology and dinosaurs before I got to the Greeks. So I used to love that stuff.
So the thing I'd like to understand is you have an individual text, and you can look at the words in that text, and you know that words evolved in a certain way during over time, and you can say that this author uses that particular ending here this percentage of the time, or there's this mix of words, and so I can pinpoint when this author was, or are you saying that you can go deeper and pick out where the oral tradition came from and where the original speakers of the text came from? How deep can you go?
Well, you can do a bit of both in a way. So, what you can't use statistics to date things absolutely. You can't tie it to an absolute date. You can do a relative chronology. So you can say, because Homer uses this form of the genitive singular X number of times, and Hesiod uses it less often, Hesiod is later. And when you bring together a number of criteria, or I have about a dozen for that, you can actually plot them on a graph and show how the line slopes. And the results were pretty consistent for the order of authorship that I was interested that I came up with. And you can also extrapolate backwards from that into where the oral tradition came from, and how far back do you have to go into the past to get to zero for the arrival of a particular linguistic feature. And so that told one certain things, not a vast amount, about the prehistory of the tradition. The thing that really shows the prehistory is the mixture of dialects, the mixture of linguistic forms, which gets into the tradition at certain points along the way. And it looks as though the tradition started in the Greek mainland, but then spread to the area around Troy, actually, which the Greeks were taking over, and then spread south into Ionia, and that's where Homer comes in. And so we can actually know a certain amount about both aspects of your question.
And so who would Homer have been? He was a poet, so he was not the original author, but his name is attached to the Iliad.
Oh, I think he could have been. He could have been his name. It's a strange name. It means hostage, but it's possible that was his name. And I think he ought to be attached to the Iliad and the Odyssey because his two poems are closer, more similar linguistically than the two poems by Hesiod, which are agreed to be by the same poet. So I think actually there was a single composer of the Iliad and the Odyssey.
And so, yeah, so you started your career with Homer, or did you start as an archaeologist?
Well, I decided that if I was going to work on Homer, I needed to understand the archaeology of Bronze and Iron Age Greece. So I did both.
And did the people who were living, for example, in the 5th century Athens, did they themselves view the Bronze Age Greeks as being did they view themselves as being descendant from those people, or were they a separate civilization in their own minds?
No, they thought they were their inheritors, definitely.
But okay, so if we do focus back in on the timeline, so now we're at 800 BCE, so we're finished with the Bronze Age Greeks, and this is now the period of the city-states. Is that the case?
Yes, out of the collapse of the Mycenaean kingdoms, which had ruled large regions, the communities which had been effectively decapitated. Their elites and kings had all disappeared. And then you get a pattern of village chiefs getting more and more authority and gathering together followers and establishing city-states, which over time evolved from just villages or ruled by warlords into towns. I mean, we shouldn't really call them cities because by modern standards they were pretty small, but they were independent, and their independence was facilitated by the landscape. I mean, one thing one needs to understand about ancient Greece and modern Greece is just how interpenetrating the mountains and the valleys and the inroads of the sea are. It's a submerged, sunken landscape, and so the city-states are cut off from one another, even over quite short distances, by really quite impassable mountains. On the other hand, places that appear to be quite far apart on the map are actually connected by sea. So you get this extraordinary pattern where the city-states are very independent, but at the same time they're very open to ideas from elsewhere. And that led to a rather unusual, remarkable phenomenon, a bit like, I suppose, the history of Germany, where you are, where you had all these independent cities and they were all trying different ways of organizing themselves. And out of that rose this remarkable civilization. And I do think that its creativity was caused by this curious mix of isolation and connection. And that was a very important element in their constant experimentation with different ways of thinking about the world and different ways of reasoning and different ways of questioning and the way these ideas could spread. And yet at the same time, the old ways still persisted to a great extent because of the the independence of these different states. And of course, over that period from 800 down to perhaps 500, 400, you get Greece gradually coalescing around two city-states. The Athenians, who were very much a sea power, very much open to the outside, open to ideas, and the most radical in their political organization, and the Spartans, whose political organization got arrested at a certain point, where they had initially, I think, been one of the most progressive states in Greece. They had not one king, but two, which limited the authority of their king. And then the authority of the kings was further limited by the election of the five ephors. But after that, they never evolved. And constitutions that don't evolve get stuck, and then they tend to cause problems for themselves and for the states around them. And the Spartans became a great military power, but a very conservative power, who relied on a population in the next state, Messenia, that was entirely subject to them and horribly treated by them. And that made them very cautious militarily because they were basically relying on slave labor for their support. Whereas the Athenians were much more open to trade, and then, of course, in 490, 480, the Persians invaded. The Greeks would have been subjected to a great Oriental empire with its capital far, far away in Susa, and would have lost their independence. But between them, the Athenians and the Spartans managed to, an extraordinary achievement, retain their liberty. And but then the Spartans dropped the ball because they were much too isolationist to want to pick things up, and the Athenians ran with it and created an empire. And this ultimately proved to be such an attractive model that the Spartans got afraid, and the two empires clashed, as it were, the Spartans and their allies, and the Athenians and their allies, who tended to be the democratic elements in the cities, whereas the Spartans were allied to the oligarchs, the cities ruled by just a few rich people. And this led to the Peloponnesian War, where the civilization turned on itself, very much the equivalent of the First World War for Europe. And then there was a revival of the Athenians to a considerable extent, but meanwhile, the center of power shifted to the north, to Macedon, where a sort of Homeric style kingship had survived among the Macedonians, and they had an absolutely brilliant king, Philip of Macedon, and King Philip managed to build such a powerful kingdom that Alexander not only subjugated the Greeks, but then led them to overthrow the Persian Empire and spread Greek culture all the way to Afghanistan and the Punjab. And Egypt and the rest of what had been the Persian Empire. So it's an amazing story. But what's most amazing to me, of course, is just how this history led them to create such extraordinary literature and to think such original thoughts compared with the civilizations that had gone before. All of it made possible by that crucial invention of the alphabet back at the beginning in the 8th century, probably the early 8th century, actually.
So who was using this alphabet though, right? If we pick a point in time, say 500 BCE, say the peak of Athenian power, perhaps, could the average citizen write? Who was literate? Who were the texts that you study, who were they written for?
Well, this is the extraordinary thing. The alphabet was such a democratizing invention. If you try to write Egyptian hieroglyphics or Akkadian cuneiform, you have to learn hundreds of signs because each sign stands for a word or a syllable, not a letter. And this alphabet enabled people to start scratching verses on pots by 700 BC. And in the period between 700 and 600, there's a scholar who has wandered the mountains above Athens, who has found hundreds of rock-cut inscriptions that were put there by shepherds and just ordinary people, ordinary farmers who would carve the word horos, boundary, on a rock just to mark where their farm ended. I think basic literacy was pretty common. And there's been a lot of discussion about this, and it really became common later in the 5th century, when Athenian power was at its highest. At that point, the Athenians had a very fine institution called ostracism. And ostracism meant that if somebody seemed to be getting so powerful within the state that they might seize absolute power and become what the Greeks called a tyrant, which just means an autocrat. It doesn't mean you have to behave tyrannically, but most of the people who did that did. If there was a threat and you could see that there was somebody who appeared to be doing that, then they could hold a vote, and the person who won the unpopularity contest had to go into exile for 10 years. How was the vote conducted? Well, you had to scratch the name of the person you wanted removed, exiled from the state, on a piece of pot. And thousands of these have been recovered in Athens, and we can see that a lot of people could write. Clearly, there were farms where people wrote hundreds of ostraca for other people to use, and after these succeeded or failed, they got dumped in wells because people had no use for them. But it looks as though writing was pretty common. I mean, everybody could probably write their name, all the free citizens, because of course, as Greek society went on and it got wealthier and wealthier, it adopted an institution which goes back as far into recorded history as we can see, unfortunately, namely slavery. You'll find words for slave in Egyptian and in Sumerian, the oldest written languages. And the Greeks adopted that, and they didn't treat their slaves any better than other societies did. But generally speaking, I think the citizens could write.
Just to give a feel for what life was like, let's say again in 5th century BCE, let's say I'm a Spartan and I want to travel to Athens. Can I do that safely? And how am I treated when I get there? And can I speak to the Athenians?
You're not allowed to travel outside Sparta without state permission and on state business. It was a completely closed society. But supposing you were an Athenian and you wanted to travel to other cities, yeah, it would be pretty easy. You just go down to the Piraeus and hop on a ship and find one that's going where you want to go. But the Spartans were a special case.
So they were Doric, and the Athenians were a different group of people.
They spoke a slightly different kind of Greek, which is more closely related to the Greek that was spoken in the Mycenaean palaces. Um, so they were descended from the more civilized of the Bronze Age Greeks, whereas the Spartans had come from the northern mountains and retained a lot of ancestral practices. But what's notable about them, as I should say, is that they all arise from this same mixture of pre-Greek, pre-Hellenic, and Indo-European speaking people. Their gods and so on were basically pretty much the same across all the city-states. Certain gods were more prevalent in certain cities. I mean, Athens was named after Athena or vice versa. Actually, I think Athens must have come first and Athena came after that. And the Spartans had a particular worship of Apollo. Certain gods had more influence in certain places, but there was a common religion that held them together, even though their dialects were, well, quite different. I mean, they were mutually intelligible. It was like a Scotsman and somebody from Newcastle and somebody from the south of England and somebody from Australia and somebody from Boston and somebody from California. They could all understand one another, but there was a bit of range of variation in their speech.
And so, how do we know all this? So, when it comes to the texts, what has actually survived? If I wrote everything down in books and stacked them up, do we have a great library or do we have a thin bookshelf?
Well, we have an awful lot of stuff written in Greek, but it's vastly less than once existed. I would say that we have, well, for example, the great Athenian playwrights who wrote tragedy, each wrote probably 100 plays, and we have seven each, except for Euripides, where there was a lucky accident and another dozen survived. So that's not a high percentage. Maybe 5 to 10% of everything that was written as high literature survives. The rest of it was lost. And of course, if you want to know how it did survive, then a lot of it was transmitted through the Roman Empire. The Romans took over the Greeks' intellectual legacy and transmitted it and transmuted it into Latin so that it spread all over Western Europe. The Roman Empire, of course, came to an end in about the year 400. And then you get it surviving in the east at Constantinople as its capital, now Istanbul, and in the Middle Ages called Byzantium. And this was the place where most Greek literature that survives intact survived. It survived by being used in education, generation after generation, and being copied and recopied and recopied by monks and scribes all the way down to the Renaissance. And then you get the invention of printing, and the diffusion of that body of Greek literature survives. But this is where papyrology comes in, which is one of my special interests. That a lot of these things that did not survive actually survive in fragments from antiquity. They were not transmitted through this long process of selection for use in school or college curricula. Instead, they were written on rolls of papyrus, and then these rolls of papyrus were mostly thrown away, or just happened to survive by some pretty unique circumstance. Papyrus doesn't naturally survive in Europe. It's too wet. Um, it rots. It's like paper. It's produced from the papyrus plant that grows in the Nile Delta, in the Nile, and this unfortunately is not durable like a potsherd. So most of that material has gone. But it does survive in Egypt. There are many, many fragments of Greek literature that come from Egypt and survive only on papyri. And then there was a second great survival at Herculaneum, where a library actually was buried by a volcanic eruption, which ensured its survival down to the present. And that's an exciting source of new texts. So the remarkable thing about Greek literature is that we keep getting new stuff, new material, and that's a great bonus.
Sometimes I speak to people on this channel, and I'm a little bit jealous of the sort of work they could. I think it would be amazing to be able to pour through some of these old texts. I have to ask you. I imagine that there are certain fields which have this nostalgia to them, right? So I'll give you an example. Astronomy is one where you have amazing equipment. You can look out into the heavens and see these objects that are wonderful, and you can imagine what they're like, but you'll never actually get there. Whereas for you, you study these 3,000-year-old texts on old papyri and this sort of thing, and maybe you get a sense for who the scribes were, or you get a sense for who the author was, but you could never actually go there, right? Do you have sort of this romanticized or sort of nostalgic feeling about the work that you do?
Absolutely. How could one not? These are real people, and you can actually grasp their reality. You can see them make a mistake and cross it out and write something else. Yeah, it's I mean, obviously there's things one doesn't want to go back into the past for. The level of squalor was terrible. The amount of poverty, I mean, we must have I can actually imagine to some extent what it was like to be a Greek peasant in the countryside with no electricity and no running water and no, but it's difficult, but in some ways it was not an impossible place to live in without those modern inconveniences. The climate was right. It was obviously the most important thing was to get water and to grow your food. You had to grow your own food. You had to make your own clothes. I mean, you had to do everything yourself. It was a very different kind of life. And of course, anything could go wrong. You could have a famine. You could have diseases that came along that you couldn't treat. And so the Greeks actually, I think, found they needed to placate their gods. The environment was a dangerous place. A lot could go wrong, and that's how the system of Greek religion arose, where the gods were sort of natural powers that needed to be placated. So the thunder god Zeus, at the head of the family of gods, the very strange combination of different things that result in the god Poseidon, the sea and earthquakes and horses, all of which are things which are characterized by a sort of rolling motion somehow. It was a strange system, but a lot of them, they felt that they could placate these powers with sacrifices and prayers, and they imagined them in human form. And Homer took this to quite an extreme, really, where the gods are very human. They feel human emotions and they behave like us, and they're like us in every way except for their remarkable powers. And over time, the Greeks came to question this, some Greeks, a small minority, I'm sure, and to say, well, how can we have gods that misbehave and that treat each other badly? So there was a quest for a higher ideal of God. And that's one of the things that came out of this remarkable civilization. And also, these people were looking at the heavens. You mentioned astronomy a while back, and asking just what are these lights that go on up there, and why do they appear with such regularity or irregularity, and why does the sun sometimes disappear, and what are these things? And to me, one of the most remarkable minds of antiquity was a scientist called Anaxagoras. He's the one who realized, I think, that the sun and the moon have to be material bodies rather than gods. And it was at that time that he came up with the explanation for eclipses, the very remarkable fact that the moon happens to be at exactly the right distance from the sun, that the sun can cause its shadow to pass over the earth and block out a large area. And in 478, there was an eclipse that covered the whole of the Peloponnese. And Anaxagoras found that out. He found it out because that was the year when when the Peloponnesians last sailed into the Aegean before they withdrew into their isolation. And he talked to sailors, probably in the harbor of Miletus, from all the different city-states around the Peloponnese, and asked them whether they had seen the eclipse. And because of that, he knew that the sun was a body larger than the Peloponnese, because it had covered the whole Peloponnese. It was really clever. And this, of course, caused a certain amount of consternation among traditional-minded Greeks who thought that the sun was a god, and that to promulgate theories like that was disrespectful to the gods and put the cities in danger. And this led to had its climax in 431, when the leader of the Athenian Empire, Pericles, elected every year by the Athenians for 20 years because he was so smart, he told the helmsman of his ship that the eclipse was nothing to worry about. It was just like somebody holding a cloak over your face for a moment. And it was no reason to get upset about it. It was just a natural phenomenon. And the word spread that Pericles was godless and brought disaster on the city when the expedition failed. And then there was the terrible plague of 430. And Anaxagoras was associated with Pericles, and he was condemned by the Athenians, by a jury. And Pericles managed to get him away before the Athenians executed him. But this, of course, leads to both modern science, the modern science of astronomy that we have, amazing things like the Greeks' first invention of the computer, the Antikythera mechanism, this analog computer, which is more sophisticated in its machinery than anything created up till World War II, and was invented in about 150 BCE. And then it also leads to a tremendous backlash against science, something that rather like what we're seeing in our own day. This is a remarkable phenomenon that's reflected in one of the other things I'm interested in, the Derveni Papyrus. Um,
We'll get into that in a moment, though, because we're covering too many topics, I think, and so
okay.
that's a very interesting topic. But so for the average Greek person, then they were very religious, right? Because my view is of the Greeks as sort of as proto scientists. They had their philosophy, their democracy, but really there was this religious power that sort of dominated their thought. Let's say.
It didn't dominate their thought, it dominated their behavior. The important thing in Greek religion was to do the observances that the gods expected. So you were supposed to do this sacrifice on that day, and this procession on another day, and these sets of prayers on another day. As long as you did those things, they didn't mind if you what you believed about the gods in particular. There was no test of faith. But you did need to observe to worship the gods that the city believed in. And there was a strong pressure among the Athenians to conform. And actually, it was their leaders, the elites of the time, like Pericles, who were the most open to thinking differently. Um, as I said, when Pericles gave an irreligious natural science explanation for the solar eclipse, he got into terrible trouble. And the Athenians actually kicked him out of office for a while and fined him.
But then, what was their conception? What was their cosmology? Where did they think the universe came from, and where did they think people came from?
Oh, this is a great question. The odd thing about the Greeks is they didn't have a very settled idea of cosmology. So there were all these different mythical accounts, some of them put forward by Hesiod, the idea that the earliest power was chaos, that is a gap. It doesn't mean chaos in our sense, it means a gap. And that then night arises as the first power, and then there's love. So you actually have forces of you actually have the invention of space and time, but they're thought of as divinized figures. Nobody worshipped the gap or chaos or eros, that's love. There was that theory. But then you ask somebody else, and they say, oh, the earliest power was Uranos, the sky, and the earth, Gaia. So there wasn't much consensus. And of course, they had no scientific basis for looking into this. And it led to the science of cosmology, of the origins of the world. People were thinking about it, and because they could think about it in different ways, different poets were free to come up with different ways, and ultimately, of course, people speculating in prose, the earliest philosophers thinking about cosmology. So, yeah, they had different theories, and there was no orthodoxy that you had to follow, but most people tended to follow Hesiod, I suspect.
And I suppose, I mean, you mentioned the Derveni text. This is a text that actually wraps together, in some sense, philosophy and religion and science. Can you give a sense, because this, as far as I understand, this is the most important papyrus found in the last 50 years, people say. Can you give some context for what this object is, how it was found, and what you have to do with it?
Sure. Well, I think it's the most important Greek text that's come to light since the Renaissance, so in the last 500 years. It showed up in a rescue excavation when they were widening a road near Thessaloniki in 1962. And it had been thrown on a funeral pyre, but it rolled off before it was completely burned. And the effect of the fire was to carbonize the papyrus, that is, to turn it into something like burnt newspaper. And burnt newspaper may seem very insubstantial to us, but as pure carbon. If you don't crush it, it's probably going to survive. It was burned without oxygen, so it was carbonized. And that meant that the contents survived and the ink survived. On the last 26 columns of a roll that probably consisted of 60, 66 to be precise. And it's the most remarkable thing. It dates from, the pyre dates from the time of Alexander of Macedon, but the copy was made in about 360, so when Plato was still alive in the 4th century. But the author was probably writing at this very time when Anaxagoras had been condemned, and Pericles thrown out of power, and the Athenians thoroughly discombobulated by the latest pandemic, which had just happened to them, when they lost faith in everything, including their leaders. The person writing it's such a strange text. So the person writing it is analyzing an account of the creation of the universe, which he ascribes to the mythical poet Orpheus, so older than Homer. But actually, it wasn't written by Orpheus. It was probably written by Pythagoras or followers of his about a century before. And rather than follow Hesiod's account, the Orphic account of the creation takes a different approach and comes up with different first gods. But, I mean, that's strange enough. But what's really strange is that the person writing about this tries to show how all of this interpretation, all of this account of the origins of the world is compatible with the latest science, the science of Anaxagoras, and that nobody should feel offended because it's all encoded in the poem. So it's like somebody, taking a book of Genesis and saying that it's actually an allegory of A Short History of Time by Stephen Hawking. This is he argues this ostensibly pretty ridiculous case by all kinds of arguments. He uses the etymology of the names of the gods. He uses logical arguments. Ultimately, he seeks to show that behind all the names of the different gods is just one god, who is Zeus, but is also mind, nous, intelligence, and that intelligence set up the world in such a way that it's ideal for humans. This is, the first instance, really, of the argument from design, the argument that the world was designed by an intelligent being to be suited to humans. And it's a pretty amazing story. And I think it must have caused great offense at the time, because he's not only divulging the Orphic poem, the one about the cosmogony, but he's critiquing, he's giving this interpretation of it when the poem was used for religious rites. So alongside the public rites that the Greek city-states had, there were these private mystery cults, including one of Dionysus, which was tied in with this poem. And in order to be initiated, you had to memorize the poem. And the author complains that the people who did the initiations didn't offer any explanation of what the poem meant. And he was better than they because he could offer that explanation, and it was in line with the latest science. And I think the religious practitioners would have seen this as deeply dangerous and offensive. And just 15 years after Pericles' fall from power, the Athenians actually had a terrible religious scandal. indicted their leading general for impiety because he was supposed to have imitated the Eleusinian mysteries at a dinner party. And they had a thorough purge of anybody who seemed to be impious, acting against the gods. And ultimately, I think Socrates fell victim to this, that the Athenians condemned Socrates because they associated him with thinking like this. And they were not entirely inaccurate in thinking he was associated with it because he studied with a follower of Anaxagoras. We know that for a fact. I think Socrates saw that, it wasn't profitable to continue those studies because the Athenians actually made astronomy illegal when they condemned Anaxagoras. They made it illegal to talk about the things in the heavens and to investigate them. So, Socrates was actually a victim of this religious backlash against science. And what's amazing about the fourth century is that Plato punished the Athenians for that by making Athens the educational center of Greece for philosophy and for his kind of philosophy. And his kind of philosophy was influenced by this latest thinking that there was a single God and that God was equated with good, although Plato was very careful not to equate God with anything physical. The Derveni author not only equates Zeus with God, but he also and with mind, but he also equates him with air, which is a physical element, and Plato regarded that as impiety. And from there, you get the whole separation of God from the world that in the Christian tradition certainly has been very important element in our thinking, that there is no divine element in the world. The divine element is above it and outside it somehow. Whereas the Greeks, they felt that if you cut down a grove of trees, which everybody venerated for years and years, you were destroying the lives of the nymphs who lived in them. So it was not a good idea to cut it down. So there was a sort of proto-ecology to early Greek religious thinking, which I think we could do well to reflect upon now.
But so this text was found in a funeral pyre,
Yeah.
and it was someone wealthy. Right. So what does this tell us about that person that they have this text on them? So they were someone themselves who was outcast, or they were someone who was this person?
Yeah, we can actually make some conjectures about it. This was in a series of a small cemetery, which appears to have been a family plot. And there were two graves, both of which have characteristics of people who were initiated into the Orphic cult. So the other grave actually has an amazing sculpted bronze vessel, gilded, with pictures of Orpheus and pictures of Dionysus on it. And the name around the rim is that it belonged to someone called Anaxagoras, who had been named after Anaxagoras, probably. Then the individual who was buried with the papyrus appears to have been a doctor, so somebody quite learned. And it looks as though these were both people who went on Alexander's expedition and came back, were sent back at a certain point with a lot of wealth that they had looted from the Persians. And in Macedonia, the Orphic cult seems to have been particularly prevalent. It was quite a common theme in the art of Macedonian tombs. So this religion, as it were, this Orphic religion with the belief in the cult of Dionysus and a single god who lies behind all of these different divine names, seems to have been quite widespread. And in fact, the Romans thought it was a threat they stamped down hard on the Bacchanalian cult, as they called it, and executed thousands of people to try to stamp it out in southern Italy when they took over southern Italy in 186 BCE. But it was, I think, the first arrival of monotheism into the Greek world. There had been monotheism, obviously, further east among the Hebrews, or at least henotheism, where you think there's just one God for your people. But this idea was taken over by the Greeks in the fifth century, and as I say, met quite a lot of resistance. And it went along with an idea in punishment after death, an idea of hell, by which moral infractions could be punished. So
the amazing thing I find here is, so this is a text that had, what was it, 27 columns. And so that's not actually a lot, right? But this is the most important text in your view of the last, say, 50 years or so. And so it makes me think that there's not much information on the ground, that, you know, we have to build up our understanding of ancient Greek culture from a thread here, a thread there. Is this really, you know, how complete are you said that we've got a complete text of the Iliad, for example.
Oh yeah. I mean, we have very large amounts of Greek literature. I mean, it takes a lifetime to read all of it in the original language. But we had nothing that led us to imagine that a text like this one could have existed. That's what was so remarkable about it. And yet, now we've got it, you can see very clearly how it fits in. And it fits into that context during the Peloponnesian War, the great struggle between Athens and Sparta, when the Athenians had become worried that they'd lost the support of the traditional gods and that it was leading them to defeat in the war. After the terrible plague which hit Athens just at the beginning of the war. So it fits in. And there are a lot of other things with which it fits, like Aristophanes' comedy, The Clouds, where he attacks Socrates for believing in views like the ones in the Derveni Papyrus. Whether or not Socrates believed in them, we don't know, but certainly The Clouds makes fun of him, and indeed has his thinkery, which is the first university invented by a comic poet, burned to the ground, the way the Pythagoreans' headquarters were burned to the ground. And of course, the Pythagoreans seem to have been associated with the Orphic texts. They were associated with the Orphic texts. So there's a whole lot going on, and actually some of the Orphic ideas seem to have come from Egyptian religion. That Pythagoras actually went to Egypt and probably picked up ideas like reincarnation, which went along with the idea of Hades, where you get punished or purged of your misdeeds in this life.
You've mentioned big names like Pythagoras and Socrates and these Alexander, names that we recognize today. I find it quite interesting that these names sort of flow through the texts. Is it a historical mistake that we know these names? You know, how important were they at the time of their lives? Would they have been revered in the way that we
in their own time?
Today?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
How important were these figures in the time of their lives? At that time in their lives, somewhat important. I mean, Pythagoras sailed to southern Italy and actually set up and took over the government of the state of Crotone and ran it. His followers ran it for decades and decades as a sort of philosopher's republic. So he was somewhat important. I mean, Socrates was probably regarded as an eccentric by the Athenians and not regarded as very important at his time. But enough of them knew about him from Aristophanes' comedy. believe the evidence against him and condemn him to death. Yeah, they were not that important as figures, but somewhat important.
Okay, so this text that so the it was found in a gravesite and it was carbonized, but how do you recover information from this? Because to my mind, it's just fragments in a fire or something that's very heavily damaged, right?
Hmm. It's not as bad as it could be. There are substantial bits of text that survive, about 20 lines out of each column. Then there's a gap between that column and the next one, but you get a series of pages, as it were. So it's not too bad. A lot of the papyri that we work on are very much worse fragmented than that one, hundreds of pieces, and it can take years and years to put one together. I've done four of those from Herculaneum, and each one took me about 7 years.
Well, we should get into Herculaneum in a second, but what does that process look like? If it takes you 7 years, what are you given to start with by presumably an archaeologist, and how do you go through the process of reconstructing it?
Well, these scrolls, the scrolls from Herculaneum, were unrolled in the late 18th, early 19th centuries by a physical uh, process. And that unrolling led to an awful lot of damage and holes and things like that. Um, we actually start from digital images that were photographed in about 2000 by Brigham Young University. They photographed the whole collection. And one starts from those. But you actually, it's very complicated. When I say it takes 7 years, obviously I was teaching full time at the same time. So it was very much my research day and my weekends and my evenings when I did it. But I had to build a model out of paper. It proved much faster than building one online. And I move my bits around until I decide that they make the most sense. And then you interpret them, you read them accurately. You have to spend a lot of time with the originals to check that the photographs aren't misleading you because they're two-dimensional, and the originals have 3 dimensions with lots of folds, undulations. A lot of things look different on the original. And it takes a while to put them all together. When they took them apart in the 18th century, they didn't keep adequate records of how they took different bits off the same scroll. So a lot of them come under different scroll numbers, and you have to find all the pieces in the same handwriting. It's complicated, but doable. But now there's this recent development with artificial intelligence, machine learning, I should call it, where we are able to scan the 280 rolls that were never opened physically, and obtain images from those. There's a splendid engineer called Brent Seals at the University of Kentucky, computer scientist, who has developed software for flattening these rolls, finding the surfaces and flattening them, and then with very high level, high intensity, high energy scanning, high intensity light beams, in fact, at the Diamond Light Source in Oxford. He's been able to produce images where we can finally distinguish the ink. And the ink was distinguished by an Australian, Luke Casey, who just stared at the images for a week and decided, what's this funny crackling to the surface? Because you can't see the ink. The whole thing is carbon. The ink is made out of carbon, and the papyrus is made out of carbon. But somehow or other, when the ink dried, there was a sort of cracking of the surface, I think. And we can see that. And then he teaches, they teach the machine to recognize that crackling, he calls it, and then to fill it in with some either white or a color, and you actually start to see letters. And from there, we got the first word, which was purple in one of the scrolls, an odd word to get. From there, now we've got parts of two scrolls becoming legible without this roll ever having been touched by human hand or damaged. And that's pretty remarkable. And that's going to give us, a couple of hundred more ancient books from this library at Herculaneum that was buried in the year 79.
Yeah, can we dive into what the library was? Because this is quite remarkable, right? It's the same eruption that destroyed what's the
Pompeii.
Vesuvius, Pompeii.
Absolutely. Well, Julius Caesar married the daughter Calpurnia of a Roman senator and very wealthy man, Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus. And he had been consul in the year 59 BCE. He then went on to govern Macedonia, and he retired, and he had this very luxurious villa on the Bay of Naples. And he had a sort of house philosopher. It was quite common for Roman aristocrats to employ a Greek to give them that veneer of culture, which was felt appropriate for a Roman aristocrat, and more than a veneer in his case. The person he chose was called Philodemus of Gadara, who was born in around 110 in what is now Jordan, and who studied in Athens at the school founded by Epicurus, a philosopher of about 300 BC. And Philodemus brought with him, when he came to work for Piso, a considerable library of books, philosophical books. He was not only a philosopher, by the way, he was also a very good poet. He wrote some very witty and rather salacious epigrams, of which we have about 30. Anyway, so he had this library, and he taught philosophy to Piso and other followers, including some of the most eminent Roman poets of the time, particularly Virgil and probably Horace. And he taught them the Epicurean view of philosophy, which was that the gods stay out of the world, they exist, but and we must respect them and worship them, but they don't intervene in human affairs. And basically, that the world is made of atoms and void, an idea which, when it was revived in the Renaissance, led to the development of modern chemistry and physics. That we should seek to live in a way that minimizes our pain and the pain of others, and not worry about death, because after death we don't feel anything. We just dissolve back into the constituent atoms that we were made from in the first place. And anyway, this philosophy had quite a wide currency in Rome at the time. Piso was a follower of it. Cicero hated it, and in fact criticizes his correspondents who believe in it. Anyway, after Piso died in about 30 BCE, the library just continued to be there. We don't know whether Piso's descendants were interested in it, but the villa probably did remain in the family because, it was quite a substantial library, and it just sat there. And it was Philodemus's library, but also the place where he was writing his works, and some of the works that we have are actually drafts. And you can see the works taking shape. There are some where there's material added on the back of the papyrus roll. because it was awkward to add it on the front. So you had to turn it over and extra paragraphs were added. Whether Philodemus's own handwriting appears, we don't know, but certainly. Anyway, it's a very remarkable collection of material, and it contains some rolls from rival schools, the Stoics notably, um, and some of the papyri go back to Athens. They were brought all the way from Athens and written in perhaps 280 BC, something like that, during the lifetime of Epicurus himself. And then there is a group of papyri in Latin. About 10% of the papyri from the villa are works in Latin that were probably kept somewhere else. And we'd like to know more about those too. There was a poem about the Battle of Actium, where the Emperor Augustus took control of the Roman world, defeating Antony and Cleopatra. It would be nice to have more of that. It was a good poem. We only have bits of Book 9. Where are the other 8 books? They're probably either left in the villa or among the rolls that still need to be opened. So there's a lot of material coming to light in this extraordinary way. And it's material which was not transmitted through the Middle Ages, through Byzantium to the modern world. It was lost at the time. And there are reasons for that. The materialist philosophies, Epicureanism, which believed in atoms and void, and Stoicism, which followed very much the lines of the Derveni Papyrus in many ways. Both of those were deemed anathema by the Christian authorities when they took over the Roman Empire later in the 4th century of our era. And so those works were lost at that time, except for Lucretius, whose work survived because it was poetry. And so it's remarkable to be able to recover a lot of these writings.
And so, similar to the Derveni Papyrus, these texts were carbonized when the volcano Vesuvius erupted, and this is why they're preserved. How did people? Is it obvious that these are texts, or what do they look like when you recover something like this?
Well, when they first recovered them, they thought they were lumps of coal, and they burned quite a few of them, thinking they were coal. Um, no, but sooner or later they broke apart, and it would have looked like a scroll of paper burned with layers, and there was writing on the inside. But since the writing was black and the background is black, you can only see it by tilting it in the light, and you get a contrast between the shiny background and the matte ink. And that contrast can be brought out much better in infrared. That's why the photographs we work with are all in infrared. And multispectral imaging is actually very helpful for that too, where you can look at different spectra, but it's mostly infrared.
And so you have personally worked on 2 of these scrolls from Herculaneum. How many, sorry?
4.
Okay, and you've reconstructed them to what extent?
Well, some of them are very hard to do very much with. There's one where I could only reconstruct about 20 columns out of 120. But there are other ones where it's 222 columns, and I should think I have 2/3 of them. So it varies, but in the best case, you can probably get 2/3 of the material back by the traditional methods, not the machine learning technology that one hopes will yield more complete texts.
But is your work now necessary as training data for the machine learning techniques? As in, is it necessary the steps that you took just to get the machine to run on its own?
Well, I didn't do any of the machine learning techniques first. That's all Brent Seal's work. I'm not an expert with these machines or anything like that. My work is still, my procedures, which I didn't invent, most of them, are still essential for the bulk of the papyri that were unrolled in the 18th and 19th century. Um, it would be nice to be able to automate those somehow, but it's not easy. Whereas the machine learning technology can be applied to the one third of the collection that wasn't opened in that way. And there, of course, the more of it we read, the more can be fed in to train the machines. But it's not possible to do that with the others. What is pretty useful is that the more of those texts we have, the more you can feed them into large language models. And effectively, classical scholars have been doing that since the computer came along. In the 1970s, David Packard created an electronic database of all of ancient Greek called the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, and we've been using that to fill in the holes ever since he came up with it. I first used it in 1984, and my own involvement with computers goes back to the days of punch cards. I was using them to create a concordance of all of early Greek epic, where you could see how each word was used in different contexts throughout the whole epic. And the whole thing used to have to be printed out. It came out as printouts, not online. And one had to run the job overnight, go back the next day to pick it up. The whole thing was encoded on paper tape with punch cards. And so, yeah, we've been doing that. And adding more texts will help us know the style of Philodemus better. Although mainly it's what scholars were doing already, and I'm not sure that large language models are really going to add very much.
Mhm. But in terms of the number, so there's 280 texts,
Yeah,
right? So
new
can you
one.
put in new ones? Can you put into context what this means for the field in terms of what does that number of texts mean in terms of what we can learn about ancient Greece in comparison to what we already have?
Well, I think it will add a lot. It was Philodemus's custom to rebut the work of earlier scholars, earlier philosophers. And he quotes a lot of earlier material, some of it very important. You never know what little nugget may come out of it. There's a nice detail about the persecution of Anaxagoras by the Athenians that comes out of Philodemus in one spot, which we don't have from anywhere else. So recently, Kilian Fleischer read for the first time a passage about the burial of Plato, about the grave of Plato in Athens. And so we'll get a lot. Um, I actually think that the 200 scrolls, 280 scrolls, should add an enormous amount to our knowledge about philosophy from the period between Alexander and the Romans, between 300 and 30 BCE, what we call the Hellenistic period. It will really add to that. It should add quite a bit to our knowledge of Roman literature, if we can get some more texts in Latin from the library. That would be very exciting. The Latinists have needed some new material. They haven't had anything new to work on for a long time. So, yeah, there's a lot. But actually, I think the most important lesson from the Herculaneum papyri, the library there, is that there's probably another library in the Villa of the Papyri, which ought to be recovered, because the site of the villa has had lava flow over it several times in the last 2,000 years, and that's rather too often for my comfort. Um, and the reason I think that there's a library is, well, first, it's always been said that somebody like Lucius Calpurnius Piso, the patron of Philodemus, would have had a really big library. If you're a major politician in the Roman Senate, you have books, you need books of history, you need books of oratory, you need books of law, you need lots of things to inform you. I mean, nowadays you might rely on the Library of the House of Commons or the Library of Congress, but he would have needed books of that sort. And where are they? They're not there. Um, and secondly, he also was a great art collector. He collected a load of very, very fine Greek sculptures in bronze, about 66 amazing pieces that are in the Archaeological Museum in Naples. And so he was a very cultured man. He ought to have had a library. Secondly, I recently worked on a papyrus in Paris that was brought from Herculaneum. And it was broken up into 350, no, 266 small pieces by a Norwegian scholar in the 1980s who was allowed to open it manually. And the result was catastrophic. Um, it was ruined, and it would have been intact if this hadn't been done. But what's remarkable about it is it turned out not to be a work of philosophy. It turned out to be a history of the successors of Alexander of Macedon. And so it's a work of history. And what was it doing there? What's even more interesting is it was copied, and that's why I worked on it, by the same scribe who wrote Philodemus's, did a copy of Philodemus's On Poems, which is what I was hoping it would be. And so it's by the same scribe. And that means that there was a scribe who did work for Philodemus, who also copied a history text. Where did he get this text? What was it doing in Philodemus's library? I think it was an escape from this other library that we haven't found. And when they entered the villa in the 18th century, they only cleared part of one level. There turn out to be two more levels of it. And there's a large area in the southeast quarter of the villa, which was never entered or planned, and we know nothing about. Back in that part of the villa, there was also an area with a big room with several doors to it on one side, and apparently banks of seating, like a lecture room. And, I think that was actually a lecture room. So there may well have been another library. There may well still be a library in the villa, which is much bigger than this one. Philodemus had 800 books, and that sounds like a lot, but in ancient times it wasn't. There was a grammarian, Sammonicus, I think was his name, in the 3rd century, who had 40,000 book rolls. So that's a fairly big library. So I hope there are still thousands of rolls in the villa, and I'd like to see archaeologists get them out. Well, now that we know we can unroll them, we can read them without unrolling them, there's really no excuse for rescuing this stuff before the volcano buries it some more in hot lava. That would take a long time to cool. Anyway, I do think that is an exceptional site. The Italians tend to lament that they have so much excavated material to care for in terms of world heritage, and of course they do. But the Villa of the Papyri is a site that has a unique distinction. It's the only place in the ancient world where a library was buried in conditions where we know it would survive. So I'd like to see them make a serious effort to recover those books, because we can now read them without harming them, as they were harmed in the late 18th, early 19th century.
But this seems obvious to me that this should be sought. So what is the actual? It's too expensive then? That's what they're saying? Or?
I think the money could be found. I think there's a certain feeling among archaeologists that you don't go digging where you think you may actually find a particular thing. It's called treasure hunting by them, and it's got a very bad name for reasonable reasons. But I don't really think it should apply to this. And they are now excavating new sectors in Pompeii, which is easy to do and not expensive. Um, the villa is buried under 70 feet of lava and tufa. And there are 18th century buildings on top of it, which would have to be moved and rebuilt somewhere else. But it was done for the Aswan Dam. The Abu Simbel temples were recovered and safely moved somewhere else. I think it ought to be possible to move an 18th century town hall. Um, so, otherwise it's tomato fields or carnations. That's another crop they grow up there on top of.
It seems like 70 feet of lava, though, would be quite protective.
Yeah, and it probably is. But the worry I have is that lava will flow over the site, and everybody will forget what's under there, and it takes centuries to go back. But it would be such a catastrophe anyway for the modern town, for the people. Nobody would worry about the books.
Hmm. It's funny that you mentioned that your worry is that history will be forgotten. I suppose you're one of the best people in the world to talk to about forgotten history, right? So I find it quite funny that these two texts were burnt and that's what made them survive, right? Is the story that we have of ancient Greece really random in some sense? We have snippets of information here and there. We're pulling up information. My question is the following: how comprehensive is our understanding? Do we have a real snapshot, or do we really have a full sense of who these people were?
I think it's pretty comprehensive. A lot of the texts we have were actually selected because of their high merit and their importance in quality. So I think the Romans and Byzantines who cut the syllabus down did it with the best of intentions. The reason why the Derveni Papyrus was so astonishing is because the ancients, particularly Plato, I think, did a very good job in obscuring how closely Socrates thought was related to this new religion, if you like, the monotheism that comes out of the Orphic texts and the interpretation of the Orphic texts. So there was a certain amount of rewriting there, but on the whole, I think we do have a reasonable picture of the Greeks. I mean, one really wants to have back the greatest Greek poetry that we've lost. I mean, seven plays of Aeschylus isn't enough. My old school teacher, a man called Andrew Wilson, has recently been rewriting in English verse all the lost tragedies of Aeschylus. And I just read some of these, and it was amazing. He had really captured what I think the voice of Aeschylus would have been. And he's done it on the basis of what we know of the plots of these plays and how we know that Aeschylus wrote. But, A. Houseman was dying to have the lost myrmidons of Aeschylus, which would have revealed perhaps the nature of the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus, according to a play by Tom Stoppard. It would be amazing to recover those things, and I'd really like to see them come back. But I do think we can understand the broad outlines. It's the details that will get filled in.
For the average audience member who doesn't have they don't have expertise in ancient Greek history or literature or philosophy, why is this interesting for them, for that person who doesn't have sort of they haven't spent their life like you looking into these things? Why is ancient Greek literature interesting and important for the average citizen?
Well, first of all, they all love Greek myth. And my students in Michigan, have all read about or heard about the Greek myths. And that's, I think, the first thing that attracts them. And then there's the mystery of, well, where did these strange stories come from? The story of Theseus finding his way into the labyrinth and killing the Minotaur, the bull-headed man in the middle of it. It's such a strange story. In fact, all to do with the Minoan custom of a sport of bull leaping, where young men had to leap over the horns of the bull in the middle of a great building, which was called the Labyrinthos, the palace. That's what the word means. And they, were often killed in the sport. So, and when that palace was presumably destroyed by the Mycenaeans, sacked by the Mycenaeans, this is the origin of that story. So there's that. There's Troy. I mean, Troy is a big draw. The movie Troy, the movie 300. People love these movies, and I love them too because they get people interested in all of this. But as you dig deeper, the reasons become even more important, I think. The origins of so many things like democracy, I mean, things we take completely for granted. It's important to know that democracy means the power of the people, and that it doesn't mean, politicians getting elected by a tiny minority and asserting that they have the right to rule everybody. So you get that. You get the origins of science. You get, as I said earlier, the invention of the first computer, the Antikythera mechanism, as it's called, which was dug up. You get the romance of this civilization being revealed since the Renaissance, and particularly since the 19th century by the beginnings of archaeological excavation. And you get extraordinary stories like the decipherment of the earliest script from the Aegean, the Linear B script, which was deciphered by a young architect who wasn't a specialist and just took it on as a puzzle and managed to read it as ancient Greek, even though he thought he was going to find Etruscan. That's an extraordinary story. And above all, I think it gives us a different way of looking at our own civilization, because it's so similar to ours and yet it's so different. That I think and it's at the origins of so many parts of modern civilization that people need to understand, and they need to see the connections between. And when you strip away a lot of the things that have happened since, you actually see those connections rather more clearly than you would, just without that basis of knowledge. And you understand the words that you're using too, if you learn about the Greeks, because they invented, the sort of 10% of the most scientific part of our vocabulary. I think it's 7%, and the rest, a lot of the rest comes from Latin, which followed on from the Greeks. So there's a lot there, a lot there.
From the people who are famous today, or the people who are alive today, who do you think will be remembered 1,000 years from now?
Oh, that's hard. That's hard. Alive today. Well, I hate to say it, but probably some of the nastiest people who are alive today. They'll be saying, how did those people get themselves elected by the mass of the people? And how did they come to be able to do such terrible things? And it's a failure of education and of imagination. People actually need to learn about the past in order to be civilized. And, we are in considerable danger of losing our civilization because of uncivilized and immoral and unethical behavior. And it's a problem. but I'm not going to name any names.
When it comes to papyrologists, what is the most exciting thing that you can discover? Because as a physicist and a mathematician, I know what the key discoveries in physics and mathematics look like. So, what is the equivalent of getting the Nobel Prize, or what is the best thing that you can do in your career as a papyrologist?
Well, I would like to discover the lost books of poetry by Sappho. I think that would be the greatest thing one could do, but I doubt very much that anybody will be able to get hold of those anytime soon. But I think she was an extraordinary poet, and I'd really like more of her.
Why don't I know this name? I mean, I know the name Plato, Aristotle.
Sappho?
What? Yeah.
Well, she was the earliest known woman poet. She was lesbian in both senses of the word. That is, she was from the island of Lesbos and she loved other women. And she wrote absolutely amazing poetry. And we have maybe 4 or 5 poems only. And they are so touching, so simple, so moving, sort of the Emily Dickinson of her time. And yeah, we've lost Sappho, and it's a disaster. I would really like Sappho back.
I didn't really expect that answer. How do you? So does that mean that you would want to go and do some archaeological dig if you had the opportunity, or how would we get Sappho back?
Well, I think we'd have to start by finding the library in Herculaneum, but I'm not sure it will be there. Might be there, might be there. I mean, Sappho was well known to Catullus in Rome in the time of Piso. I don't see how else you would get it back. Um, there is the question that there are probably a lot of ancient books lying on the bottom of the Black Sea um, because some ancient ships that were loaded with books, if they sank in the Black Sea, would have the carbon materials preserved because there's no oxygen down there. That's another place where I think we might find ancient books.
Have people successfully recovered books in that way?
Oh no, it's a sheer guess. But they have recovered bits of paper from the wreck of the Titanic after more than a century. You can read the menu on the day before the Titanic sank and see that they were having roast beef or something. So it's probable there are some books down there too. But I think Herculaneum is actually the strongest bet.
Well, on that note, Richard Janko, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure. I've had a wonderful time.